are at war with Japan.
But Australia will make him inch by inch, and that he shall not enter upon our country.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Hello, this is Michael Madden. Welcome to the next episode of Virtual Battlefield Flyovers. Today we are on an island, about to head off on a very short flight to one of the most famous places in Australian military history. So today we are flying to Gallipoli. The sun is just coming up over here, as you can see. I think we'll just get underway and we'll start talking on the way out. So I'll use this flight and to talk a little bit about Gallipoli and what happened there, although I think most people already know. As you know, Australia and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, landed at Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915, the beginning of what was a disastrous campaign. A campaign that cost Australia about 9,000 lives. Though that was a lot and was an absolute tragic waste, it sadly paled into significance compared to what was to come on the Western Front. I'm going to stay really low in this flight. I'm going to come in from the directions that the ships came in from and that the men on boats came in from. I'll use this flight to bring me on to the next one, which will be on the Western Front. The subject of these two flights, for the most part, is going to be a man by the name of Jacka. Albert Jacka was a Victoria Cross recipient. Not just a Victoria Cross recipient, he was our first of the Great War. But I might just settle in here at 1,000 feet. Now, Jacka was arguably, he was certainly the most famous Australian alive during the Great War. In fact, he was one of the most famous people in the world. We'll show you roughly where his VC action took place and talk a little bit about others as well. And tell you his story through the next video, which will take us onto the Western Front. So we're flying in directly to the east. As I said, this is the direction that the ships came in from. They dropped the men off a fair distance from the shore and they rowed ashore in fairly simple boats. Of course, what was awaiting the men at Anzac Cove was not at all what they expected. They were dropped off in the wrong position, not a huge way out, but enough to make it a problem, and they were met by extreme resistance from the Turks. who fought hard. And despite that, the Australians, what was their first taste of warfare, they charged on in. And of course Anzac Day is a very big deal in Australia. It's probably one of the most important days on our calendar. To me it's the most important. This year obviously with COVID-19 we didn't celebrate or remember Anzac Day the way we normally do, but a lot of people made the most of it and got out to their driveways with their family members' medals and celebrated or remembered it as best they could. So the idea of the whole thinking behind the Gallipoli campaign was to take the Gallipoli Peninsula and open up the Dardanelles, which is the waterway behind the peninsula, just on the other side of us here. The thinking was with the Dardanelles open, the British could get their enormous fleet through into the sea on the other side, which the Marmara Sea I think it's called, which leads directly into Istanbul, and from there they believed that just the mere presence, I think, of the mighty British fleet would cause the Turks to basically curl up and surrender. Of course that idea was foolish and it never happened. They never took the peninsula, and as a result they never got any ships through the Dardanelles. The entire campaign was an absolute disaster and a resounding defeat. Going to go down a little bit here so we get a little bit closer to the coast. This is Anzac Cove in front of us. Suvla Bay to the north. Now the ships came in before sunrise that morning, the men rowing ashore into certain death in a lot of cases, and spitting machine guns. This is the beach where they landed. This is Anzac Cove. As you can see, this in the simulator, the terrain here is really not that representative of what it looks like. I've never been there in person, but it was certainly a lot more traumatic than this. It was cliff faces, but nevertheless this is where they landed and the hills they had to traverse to try and take it. They did not get very far, although a couple of them did. In fact, a Victoria Cross recipient by the name of Arthur Blackburn, he and a mate of his made it further inland than any others. They made it about 2 kilometres in that morning. Had they been able to hold that position, the whole campaign would have been very, very different. I've gained some altitude here and we can give us an opportunity to have a look down on the peninsula and show you what it is. There's really not that much to it. I believe the positions we're flying over here is basically, this is roughly where Lone Pine is. Up a bit behind us actually. Further up is Courtney's Post and places like that. The Neck, which is down off the other side of that ridge I believe. The Sphinx is here too, all these famous places. And there is the Dardanelles off to the east, the sun coming up. over the sea. And that was what it was all about, was opening up that body of water there. There were some shocking battles at Gallipoli, none worse than Lone Pine. 7 Australians were awarded the Victoria Cross for that battle. The most of any battle for Australia. You can see Suvla Bay in front of us, and I think that's the Salty Bay or some Salty Bay or something they call that. Just off our left wing there, I think down that way is where you would find the Neck, and further along Courtney's Post and Monash Valley, and of course Lone Pine, the most famous place of all. The Neck is the place where Mel Gibson's famous movie Gallipoli, where that horrible scene occurred, where the Australians were forced to run against a very small piece of ground directly into a barrage of fire, and without any protection they were slaughtered. Absolute disaster and the height of stupidity. There's a lot of stupid things done in World War One, with the exception of Fremel's, perhaps, as far as stupid things that involved Australians. The Neck was probably the dumbest. The only real victory we had here was Lone Pine, which I think is down that way on top of the ridge. It was a victory. Probably a pointless victory, but a victory nonetheless. And really the only one that we had, apart from the submarine, I think by the name of QE2, actually made it to the top of the Dardanelles and managed to get through the mines there, and was probably classed as a victory too, although it was scuttled in the end and sunk, so again that didn't amount to anything. Interestingly, those two things, two victories for Gallipoli, during what I was writing my book, The Victoria Cross Australia Remembers, I interviewed the grandson of a Victoria Cross recipient from the Boer War. Sir Neville Smythe. He was a British man, an incredible family. Amazingly, his family claims both of those victories. His the grandfather, Sir Neville Smythe, commanded the Anzacs at the Battle of Lone Pine. He was in charge. He took command of them, and he led them through to that victory. He was already a Victoria Cross recipient. I believe it was his son-in-law was on the QE2. I can't remember if he was a commanding officer of the QE2 or he was just on board. It was, I believe, his wife's husband. So that family has a connection to both of the Australian victories here. So yeah, down this way, it's not massively accurate, but sort of between these, in the closer to the road, closer to the water, I think you would find Lone Pine. The Australians went hand to hand with the Turks there for days. It was absolutely brutal. They stormed the trenches just to find that they were covered with wood, and standing in the open they had to pull the tops off the trenches and then drop in to what was fully manned and loaded trenches. Of course they went in with 303s and bayonets, which were useless in such shockingly confined quarters. There was no room. You can imagine how, if you've ever seen a 303 with a bayonet on the end of it, it's very long. It would have been completely useless down there. The fighting went on for a long time and it was brutal. They were killing each other with their bare hands. It's absolutely shocking. The Australians took it and held it. Courtney's Post is below us. This is where Albert Jacka received his Victoria Cross. Now, it was the first Australian VC of the war. In my podcast, Australia Remembers, I interview Michael Lewinsky, author of Hard Jacka, the greatest book about Albert Jacka ever written, in my opinion. Michael's a great guy, he's a friend of mine. He makes a really, really strong argument about Jacka's action at Courtney's Post. He calls it the most important VC action of all time. And he makes a pretty good argument for it. If we turn around, I can show you roughly where it is and why Michael makes that claim. The trench, an Australian trench, had been overrun. This is in May. It was the biggest push the Turks did during the Gallipoli campaign. The Australians expelled nearly 1 million rounds repelling this Turkish push. It was an enormous offensive by the Turks, tried to push the Australians back, and they took this trench in Courtney's Post, and Jacka decided to take it back. He, with the help of some mates sort of throwing grenades, he got across no man's land and jumped down into that trench. Had 7 Turks in it. He killed all 7 of them and managed to hold the trench all night. He shot 5 and bayoneted 2 that night. Now Michael makes a really good argument. You can see where Courtney's Post is, sort of in this area. There was 2 machine guns at either end of that trench, Australian machine guns, that were holding back the entire Turkish attack. Had those machine guns been knocked out, and Michael is right about this, there would have been nothing to stop the Turks coming through. They would have taken that trench and they would have held it. Jacka's actions meant that those guns kept firing. What that means, if the Turks had have taken Courtney's Post, they certainly would have brought their artillery forward. From Courtney's Post, you could make the argument that their guns would have reached the beaches and they would have been able to drop artillery on the Australians and Anzac Cove, and that would have ended the Australian campaign. That we would have been utterly annihilated. It's a really good argument. In my opinion, I think there is a VC action as far as just sheer effectiveness and importance on the entire campaign or an entire battle. McTeer's on the Western Front, I would argue his was more effective than Jacka's. Whether it had the same effect on the entire campaign, obviously not. The campaign on the Western Front was so enormous. To suggest that any one battle would have had an impact in the way that Jacka's did would not be correct. So I probably have to bow to Michael here. So you can see the peninsula. This is how small it is. Now, as I said, Arthur Blackburn made it 2 kilometres inland. It's probably a third of the way across, I guess. A long way inland. He had to return. It was him and one other man. He went on to receive the Victoria Cross on the Western Front. He was an officer during World War II, and he was actually captured by the Japanese in World War II. Arthur Blackburn was a very, very good soldier, and he holds the honour of making it further in than anybody else. As you can see, the whole idea was foolish. There was guns and forts all along the Dardanelles here. As we fly over the other side of the peninsula, I'm going to land at that airport down there. Because Australia pulled out of Gallipoli in December. I guess you would say that is the other victory, or the other thing which was done to effectively was the retreat. Normally in military terms, a retreat or withdrawal is the most dangerous thing you can do. You generally lose a lot of lives in a fighting retreat. Australia and the Allies, the British, were finally given the orders to leave here in December, and it created a problem because they had a massive setup on these beaches here to the west. The problem being, how do they get out without having massive loss of lives, because the Turks would just come in and annihilate them. It was a very clever operation. Australian ingenuity came into play, where they had rigged up these clever little devices which would, I think, drip in water into cans and pull the trigger on rifles left behind to keep firing shots, so that rifles would fire long after they had all left. The withdrawal was carried out. It was carried out successfully with no loss of life. I understand nobody was killed. It was absolutely extraordinary. So Albert Jacka became incredibly famous after his VC action. His battalion, the 14th Battalion, is arguably the most famous battalion in Australian history. That and the 39th Battalion from the Kokoda track, which we spoke about in the first episode. Jacka was a Lance Corporal at the time of his VC. The entire 14th Battalion called themselves Jacka's Mob, and you can imagine how that infuriated his commanding officers. He had a bit of a problem with authority. He always stood up for his men. If the officers were going to send them into a bad situation, Jacka had no problem storming into a tent and yelling at commanding officers. And this presented a problem because, being a VC, the Victoria Cross is the highest award for anything you can be awarded for anything in the world. It is the highest award. It's taken so seriously that any officer has to salute a Victoria Cross recipient regardless of their rank. So even as a Lance Corporal, if Jacka was to walk into a general's tent, that general would salute him and he would not have to return the salute. Politically, it created a huge problem. The fact that Jacka was so abrupt and determined to stand up for his men, and disrespectful, I guess, to some command, it created a huge problem because he probably would have been court-martialed for the way he spoke to some officers had he not been a VC. But a VC he was. And of course he was sent for training later and excelled in his training and ended up by the end of the war a captain. Probably should have been higher in my opinion. The most famous thing about Albert Jacka is probably summed up very well by Charles Bean, the official historian of Australian historian of the Great War, and I guess the founder of the Australian War Memorial. Bean said anybody who knows the story knows that Jacka should have been given the VC or earned the VC 3 times. Now a lot of people argue 4, and I think 3, and a DSO, which would make him by far the most decorated human being in history. He should have been. That's not debated by anybody. The fact that he was the greatest frontline fighting soldier of all time is pretty much academic. And Charles Bean also said of his actions at Pozieres on the Western Front, where he should have got his 2nd Victoria Cross, but it was downgraded to a military cross. Charles Bean said that that was the most audacious act of individual gallantry in the history of the AIF. Michael Lewinsky, again, in a podcast, summed that up really, really well. He said what Charles Bean was saying there was, if you were to take Albert Jacka's actions at Pozieres, and I'll talk about that in the next episode, what he did there. If you were to take his actions at Pozieres and say that is the example, that is the benchmark that has to be reached to be awarded a VC, and you were to say nothing below that receives a VC, then what he's saying was that nobody else in the entire war would have been awarded a Victoria Cross. His actions were so extraordinary. And as Michael says, to not have a Victoria Cross awarded at all for that action, in fact a military cross, which is the third highest, a level 3 award, was absolutely appalling, disgusting and inexcusable, particularly for the reasons that happened, which everybody knew. That the commanding officers hated him with a passion, and I believe have even at stages made mention of the fact that no matter what, they will never give Albert Jacka another VC, no matter what he does. His actions at Bully Court were, again, he was awarded for recommended for a third Victoria Cross. He got another military cross. I don't think that was a VC in my opinion. I think it was a DSO. I don't think it was a military cross. It was higher than that. I believe it was a DSO, which is for leadership and command in battle. That's what I think he should have been given. Polygon Wood is the fourth one, where Jacka was again recommended for a Victoria Cross and or a DSO. I think what he did was probably a Victoria Cross there. I think that should have been his third. It was arguably his finest hour, particularly as a commander, I think. But we'll get into all that in the next episodes. So it's kind of a two-part episode or two-part series on Albert Jacka, starting here at Gallipoli. As I said, I didn't talk too much about what happened here. I think we all know the Gallipoli story well enough. Okay, so thank you once again as the sun comes up here. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'm really looking forward to the Western Front and we go deeper into the Albert Jacka story. Thanks for watching.